Welcome to Short Movie Channel. Today's movie begins in the 19th century, specifically in an isolated village in Pennsylvania, deep within the woods. All the villagers gather to attend the funeral of Lion August, one of the village's men. After the funeral and burial ceremonies are completed, everyone sits down to have lunch together. Suddenly, they hear strange sounds coming from the direction of the forest. Noah Percy, a resident of the village who suffers from a disability and growth deficiency, starts laughing and clapping enthusiastically when he hears those sounds. The film then introduces us to some of the villagers' strange customs and traditions. For instance, the color red is strictly forbidden in the village. Additionally, every night, a man named Fenton goes up to the watchtower to keep an eye on the surrounding forest. If he notices anything unusual, he immediately informs the villagers. One morning, when Mr. Edward arrives at the school, he sees the children gathered around something odd. He approaches them and finds them standing around the bloodied, skinned carcass of an animal. Edward asks the kids who did it, but they all swear they didn't do anything and claim they found the animal's body just lying there. Later, when everyone is gathered inside the classroom, Edward asks them who they think could have done such a terrible thing. The children respond that it was probably the creatures or monsters from the Forbidden Forest, those they never speak about, because these monsters are known to eat flesh. However, Edward doesn't believe them and reminds them of the truce between the villagers and these creatures. The villagers don't enter the creatures' forest, and the creatures don't come into the village. Meanwhile, the village elders and leaders are having a meeting in a room that resembles a Senate chamber. Suddenly, a man named Lucius Hunt enters with a paper in hand. He reads from it, and says he's here because of a child who died in the village due to the lack of medicine. Lucius emphasizes that it's unacceptable for anyone to die so easily because medicine isn't available. He asks for permission to cross the Forbidden Forest and travel to the towns beyond it to bring back a large supply of medicine for the villagers. However, the council members ultimately reject his request. Later that night, Lucius goes to the watchtower and starts a conversation with Fenton. He asks him about his opinion of the other towns beyond the Forbidden Forest. Fenton responds that those towns are full of evil and corruption, inhabited by murderers and criminals, and are fundamentally unsafe. The next morning, the villagers find another animal carcass, covered in blood, skinned, and dumped nearby. Immediately, the village elders call for an emergency meeting with the residents to address this serious issue. They suggest that it's probably a wild predator, like a wolf, responsible for these attacks. They also insist that whatever is doing this doesn't belong to the Forbidden Forest creatures. After the meeting ends, Kitty, Edward's daughter, goes to Lucius and confesses her love for him. However, Lucius doesn't feel the same way. Heartbroken, Kitty returns home, crying all night. Her blind sister, Ivy, comforts her and reassures her, saying, "This isn't the end of the world. Someday, you'll meet someone who loves you back." Later, we see Ivy and Noah running together up the village hill, racing to reach the large rock at the top. Ivy runs confidently and effortlessly, as if she isn't blind at all. When they reach the rock, they find Lucius there. Noah offers him some food, and Ivy begins talking to Lucius, mentioning how her sister cried all night because of him. Noah then runs off to chase a bird, while Lucius turns to Ivy and tells her, "You run fast, just like the boys." Noah returns with a bright red flower he pulls from his pocket and places it in Ivy's hand. She feels happy and excited, but Lucius warns her, "Be careful. That flower in your hand is the forbidden red color." Ivy becomes startled and says, "We need to bury it immediately." Curious, Lucius asks Noah where he got the red flower. Noah replies, "I found it near the rock. I sneak into the Forbidden Forest often without anyone in the village noticing." In the next scene, we see Lucius reading another letter to the village council, telling them about the red flower Noah found near the rock. He also informs them that Noah freely enters and exits the forest without encountering harm. He argues that if Noah can do it, so can he, and that the creatures won't attack him either. Lucius requests permission to travel beyond the Forbidden Forest to reach nearby towns for medicine and supplies, but the council refuses his request once again. That night, when Lucius returns home, his mother, Mrs. Alice, talks to him, urging him to abandon his idea. She reminds him that his father once tried to do the same thing, only to be found dead and naked in the river. Lucius responds, "Why don't you understand? I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for the entire village." However, Alice continues, telling him, "The towns beyond the Forbidden Forest are unknown to us. We know nothing about them." Lucius replies, "Mom, every place has its mysteries, just like we do here in the village. Everyone has secrets in their life that no one knows about, like your black box, for example." Lucius tries to open the box to see what's inside, but Alice stops him. The next morning, we see a group of young villagers dressed in long, cloak-like outfits patrolling the village's borders near the Forbidden Forest. They make sure the oil lamps are lit to prevent anyone from accidentally wandering into the forest. Among them is Lucius, who stays behind when the group returns to the village. Unnoticed by the others, Lucius ventures into the Forbidden Forest. He stumbles upon more red flowers and hears the growling of the creatures. Alarmed, he sees one of the creatures fleeing into the distance. Lucius picks some of the red flowers, exits the forest, and returns to the village. That night, Lucius meets Ivy, who tells him, "I heard you want to go to the towns beyond the Forbidden Forest to get medicine and supplies for us. That's a noble and selfless act, but it's not the right thing to do. It's too dangerous." She also mentions, "By the way, my older sister got married," before heading back inside the house. Later, at the watchtower, the guard, Fenton, hears a strange sound from below. At first, he assumes it's Lucius coming to chat, as he often does. But when Fenton looks through the tower opening, he is shocked to see one of the Forbidden Forest creatures, dressed entirely in red. Unsure of what to do, he hesitates before finally ringing the tower's alarm bell. The sound spreads panic and fear throughout the village. That night, everyone rushed to their homes and entered the secret basements. The villagers quickly gathered the children to bring them into the basements for safety. While Kitty was also gathering the children to protect them, we see Ivy standing alone in front of the house. Suddenly, she extends her hand, and one of those creatures approaches her, almost grabbing her hand. But Lucius appears out of nowhere and pulls her inside so she can hide in the basement with them. The next morning, red marks are seen on the doors of all the village houses. The village council calls for an urgent meeting to discuss what happened the previous night after the Forbidden Forest creatures entered the village. It becomes clear that the red marks are warnings from the creatures, but there must be a reason why the Forbidden Forest creatures entered the village to deliver this warning. The council receives a note of confession from Lucius, in which he admits that he had entered the Forbidden Forest the previous morning, picked a red flower from there, and brought it into the village. He apologizes and says he's ready to accept any punishment. Edward stands up and approaches Lucius, who is crying and feeling remorseful, thinking he might have caused the village's complete destruction the night before. Edward tells him, "I don't want to see you crying. Anyway, nothing happened, and it ended peacefully, but I want you to learn from this mistake." A few days later, the villagers celebrate Kitty's wedding, Edward's daughter and Ivy's sister. The wedding is filled with food, music, and dancing, and everyone is happy and enjoying themselves. We see two young men from the village wearing yellow robes and throwing meat to the Forbidden Forest creatures onto a large rock. But suddenly, while everyone is dancing and enjoying the celebration, they hear the sound of children screaming. The wedding is immediately halted, and Edward calls everyone to ask what happened. They tell him they saw the creatures in the village and warn them that the entire village must leave. The wedding is cancelled, and Edward instructs the villagers to return to their homes immediately and lock their doors. They also find many of their animals slaughtered and skinned throughout the village, leaving everyone terrified and filled with fear. In the middle of the night, Ivy wakes up and steps outside the house to find Lucius sitting alone. She sits next to him, and they talk for a while. During the conversation, Lucius confesses his love for her, and she admits that she loves him too. The next day, Noah visits Lucius and tells him that news of his engagement to Ivy has spread across the village. Noah seems upset and frustrated. The film reveals that Noah is in love with Ivy. In a fit of rage, Noah stabs Lucius in the stomach with a knife. Afterward, Noah goes to Mr. Percy's family, with his hands covered in blood, and tells them, "This is the forbidden color, the color red." The villagers realize that Noah stabbed someone, and they search the entire village for the victim. When Ivy learns of the incident, she is sure that Noah stabbed Lucius out of jealousy after hearing about their engagement. She rushes to Lucius's house and finds him lying on the floor, bleeding and completely unconscious. Edward arrives later, and Lucius is taken to a house designated for medical treatment. Later, Ivy talks to her father, Edward, and asks for permission to travel to other towns beyond the Forbidden Forest to bring back medicine and treatments to save Lucius. Edward goes to the doctor, who informs him that Lucius has a severe bacterial infection in his wound and mentions that if they had proper medicine, they could save him. Edward then takes his daughter Ivy for a walk, and they eventually reach an old storage room. He asks her to promise not to tell anyone about their plans. Then, Edward heads toward the storage room to open it. In the next scene, we see Ivy with her father as she packs her bag. She talks to Lucius, who is in a complete coma, and tells him, "I'm going to go get the medicines for you. It'll just take half an hour." Ivy, wearing her yellow cloak, reaches the edge of the village near the Forbidden Forest, where she meets the guard, Finton, and another young man named Christo, who are both dressed like her. Ivy raises her hand, holding a small pouch, and she and Finton step into the Forbidden Forest. After walking for a while, Christo stops, clearly scared. Ivy reassures him, saying, "There's no need to be afraid. I have the magic stones in this pouch." But he's too frightened and decides to return to the village. Finton, too, gets scared and backs away when he hears a sound coming from the trees. Just like Christo, he returns, leaving Ivy alone in the Forbidden Forest. Ivy then opens the small pouch she has and scatters the magic stones on the ground. The movie takes us back in a flashback, showing the moment Ivy entered the old storage room with her father, Edward. He makes her touch the claws of the creatures and monsters of the Forbidden Forest, and she's utterly terrified. However, he reveals the truth to her, explaining that the creatures and monsters are nothing more than costumes and large puppets they created. He tells her that all the members of the council also know about this. The purpose, he explains, was to create a closed-off community free from the evils and corruption of the outside world and the cities beyond the forest. He hands her a pocket watch and a piece of paper listing the medications needed for Lucius's condition. He also gives her instructions on how to navigate the forest and reach the cities beyond it. Edward warns her never to mention the village to anyone in the outside world. The movie returns to Ivy in the forest. Suddenly, she falls into a pit but manages to grab the edge, pulling herself back up and continuing her journey. She begins to hear noises around her, growing louder and more frequent. Frightened, she continues walking until she stops in the middle of a patch of red flowers. Suddenly, one of the creatures appears before her. Ivy tries to calm herself and runs, but the creature chases her. She stumbles into the trunk of a tree and freezes, spreading her arms wide, like the bravery game children play in the village. As the creature approaches her from behind, it falls into the same pit Ivy had fallen into earlier. Back in the village, we discover that Noah is no longer in his cell. He has escaped. The council members realize that Noah found one of the monster costumes in the basement and used it to escape. The movie shifts back to the creature in the pit, revealing that it's actually Noah. He dies from the fall. Finally, Ivy finds her way out of the forest. She leaves her yellow cloak and bag on the ground, climbs over a wall, and successfully crosses to the other side. Back in the village, the council members open their black boxes, reflecting on their past. We learn that they once lived in the cities but were victims of various forms of violence. After meeting in therapy sessions, they decided to create an isolated village to live peacefully away from the outside world. It's also revealed that the village isn't actually set in the 19th century as the villagers believe, but in modern times. Meanwhile, Ivy crosses to the other side and is spotted by a police officer named Kevin, who stops his car and approaches her. He speaks to Ivy, who tells him she came from the forest and desperately needs the medications listed on the paper. Kevin is skeptical of her story, especially because she's dressed in old-fashioned clothing. She hands him the paper and the pocket watch her father gave her as payment for the medicines. Realizing someone is critically ill, Kevin agrees to help her. Ivy is overwhelmed by his kindness, something she didn't expect from the city people. Kevin goes to his office, gets the medicines, and returns to give them to Ivy. She takes them, climbs back over the wall, puts on her yellow cloak, picks up her bag, and heads back to the village. When the village learns of her return and that she killed one of the forest creatures, Edward explains to the council members that Noah's death will reinforce the villagers' belief in the story of the monsters, allowing them to continue living peacefully. Ivy enters the room where Lucius lies, holding his hand. She tells him she's back and that he will recover, so they can be together again, get married, and live happily ever after. And with that, the movie ends. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support us if you enjoyed it.